Thanks for joining, everyone. This RDAR Digital Learning Series seminar. First, I need to thank Callie for all of her hard work and effort in organizing this, as well as Devin for helping coordinate with our partner Cobras. And welcome to our partner Cobras doing the opioids and overdose work. So welcome, everyone. So this is going to be a really fun opportunity. I am super stoked. I know other people are really excited. What we're going to be doing today is sort of hearing from 3 project leaders, 2 from RDAR and 1 from one of our partner Cobra centers. And we're going to hear first a little bit about a research that they've read about that they're super excited, found super interesting. And then we're going to hear a bit about their project and what they're doing. So looking forward to hearing each presentation, looking forward to learning all kinds of new things. So what we'll hear is sort of 5 minutes about the new paper, 5 minutes of overview of their own research, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions and the discussion. And that's where you'll hear, where you raise your hand and for the chat and everything. So with that, I'm not going to eat up any time doing anything else. And I want to turn it over to our first presenter, which is our own Nick Hubbard, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. And he's a project leader on the project title called Connectomes related to active methamphetamine dependence project. Sorry about that. Nick, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks so much, Rick. I didn't know that this could be on any paper we were interested in, or else I wouldn't have presented mine. So sorry, you guys are stuck with one of my papers. But let me see if I can figure out how to share this guy really quick, and then we'll get on with it. All right. So can folks see my PowerPoint screen? No? Thumbs up? All right. So let's get started. So again, thank you guys all for coming out, even though it's digitally, and listening to me talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent article that I've published that was looking at reward-related neural signaling in adolescent working memory development. And for those of you who might be more interested in substance abuse, I think a lot of people would know that reward-related processes are incredibly important in substance abuse, and this will be something that I'll talk about slightly when I give an introduction to my RDAR Center project. So in adolescence, working memory, or this ability to process and maintain goal-relevant information over a short duration of time, in adolescence, this ability is still developing. As you can see in the figure here, working memory ability tends to peak around our early to mid-20s. And then unfortunately for, I think, most of us, it declines. So we're all stuck on the flattening end of the curve, if you would. So in adults, communication between the brain's reward and executive regions, this communication is actually thought to enhance our working memory abilities. However, in adolescence and even in young children, the pathways that facilitate this communication, they're still developing. So one question that I had with this work was, can communication from adolescents' reward regions, is that even capable of enhancing the working memory neural patterns in executive regions, similar to what we would see or what we might expect to see in adults? So essentially, is this mechanism, this adult mechanism, even possible in adolescence? And a second question is, well, if it's possible, do we see age-related differences in communication between reward and executive regions? Do these emerge in early adolescence? And is this communication, does it happen to be related to the development of working memory ability? So does this mechanism systematically vary between adolescents? Does it vary with age? Does it vary with their abilities? So in my study, we recruited 36 young adolescents, and they all underwent functional magnetic resonance imaging while they're performing two separate tasks. So one task we used to localize where their reward centers were in their brain, and the second task was used to actually look at the communication patterns between the reward and within the reward and executive regions while these adolescents were doing a working memory task. And then we also obtained data from a battery of, I think, 5 or 6 working memory tests. And we use this information to obtain a latent variable of the adolescent's working memory ability or in their working memory development. So the first question is does this adult mechanism, does it actually work in adolescence despite having continued development of the communication pathways? So we looked at this, and so first I'll say that the evidence does suggest so. So one neural signature of adult working memory is the ability to stabilize the patterns of communication and of activation in executive regions over brief periods of time. So while they're trying to remember or keep active this goal relevant information in working memory. So what we did is we said, well, what happens if we lesion computationally, meaning remove the variance that might be accounted for by communication with the reward center and the reward regions and the executive regions. So when we lesioned that communication, we were actually able to significantly reduce the stability of these executive neural patterns. And importantly, we also assessed 2 key dissociations. And in figure B here, what we actually looked at was, well, okay, so what happens if we lesion any old region or any old active region in the brain? What happens if we lesion that communication to executive regions? Do we get a similar decrease in the stability of these neural patterns? And the answer is no. We get much greater decrease when we lesion the reward region. And the second question, or the second dissociation that we looked at was, well, what happens if we lesion the communication from the reward region to other active memory regions? Do we still get the same effect in terms of reduced stability? And again, the answer is no. We see a much greater decline when we lesion the executive regions, or when we lesion the reward communication to the executive regions, as opposed to when we lesion the reward communication to other regions. And so we have somewhat been able to establish that this mechanism is probably going on and is probably being used to enhance the stability of these neural patterns in adolescence. But the second set of questions were, well, does it vary systematically? So do we find age-related differences? And again, evidence suggests so. So during our working memory performance, our older adolescents, part of our study, demonstrated more stable communication patterns between the reward and executive regions relative to the younger adolescents. And we also found that these communication patterns between reward and executive regions actually were related to enhanced working memory ability or enhanced working memory development. So the more stable the communication patterns were between these regions, the greater the working memory of the adolescent was. So what does this suggest? So I would suggest that the reward executive enhancement mechanism that is available to adults is probably also available, possibly to a lesser extent, in adolescence. So communication between reward and executive regions does seem to serve a similar function in adolescents' working memory as it does in adults. That is, to enhance the stability of neural patterns in these executive regions. And second, I would also say that this mechanism, we found pretty convincing evidence that this mechanism does systematically vary with age and working memory ability. So this also suggests that the development of these communication pathways between reward and executive regions of the brain might actually offer one novel mechanism to at least partially explain some age-related changes or age-related enhancement in working memory ability. So as for our future directions, so reward processes are robustly linked to various adolescent psychopathology, particularly depression and substance abuse. So we're currently examining whether we might see disparate effects in anxious and depressed adolescents compared to, say, typically developing adolescents. So is there some evidence that changes to this reward system and changes to this reward executive enhancement mechanism might relate to cognitive changes in these groups as well? And the second direction is really most relevant to my RDAR project, is that reward processes are very closely linked to a lot of different maladaptive behaviors, including substance abuse, and these also can be affected by these behaviors. So one thing that my RDAR Center project will do is it will examine the reward processes and the systems involved in reward-related signaling in a large sample of persons who are currently using methamphetamine, or I should say actively using methamphetamine. So that sort of gets me to my RDAR Center project, and so I just want to give you guys a brief introduction on that. So as Rick had mentioned, the project is called Connectomes Related to Active Methamphetamine Dependence Project, or CAMP. Nobody told me this explicitly, but I was convinced that if I did not have a backronym, I would not be able to get this funded, just looking at the history of the project. So I came up with CAMP, and that was the best I could do. But so the primary question that we have in CAMP is, can we use MRI measures of reward, executive, and affective systems along with measures of key psychological and social variables to predict longitudinal outcomes in persons using methamphetamine? So this biopsychosocial prediction of two select and what I would say are key outcomes in persons using methamphetamine. So substance abuse patterns, or substance use patterns, excuse me, and occupational functioning. So I won't go into all of the details regarding why we selected these measures, but what I can say is that the bio, psycho, and social variables that were chosen for CAMP have been directly or indirectly linked to CAMP's chosen outcomes in individual studies of persons using methamphetamine. So you can sort of get a brief view of this in the table that I have here. And what we've seen from our other clinical projects in brain imaging and even broader is that aggravating relevant bio, psycho, and social measures actually can improve the clinical outcome predictions in other groups like binge drinking, as well as there's been some work in social anxiety and various other psychopathologies. So my guiding idea behind CAMP is pretty simple, and it's that more and relevant data will lead to better outcome predictions for persons using methamphetamine. So we leverage previous correlates of methamphetamine use in attempt to optimize the predictive variance in persons using methamphetamine, their outcomes. So how will we accomplish this? And so obviously we rely heavily on the relationship with RDAR and the amazing sample that's being collected through that. So we'll be capitalizing on the 600 illicit substance users that are screened and gathered as part of the RDAR study. And we will then, we predict about 30% of those based on Nebraska treatment admission data will be active methamphetamine users. And so our hope is to be able to characterize 100 persons using methamphetamine that would be willing and meet our study criteria to participate. And then we assume we're going to do a 6-month follow-up with outcome for this first leg of the study to look at changes in those occupational functioning and substance use patterns measures. So we assume about 25% attrition and data loss at that point. So at the end, we should have about 75 samples. So why would we do this? So in terms of scientific innovation, this will actually be the first study to examine neurobiological, psychological, and social measures in a single sample of persons using methamphetamine, as well as integrate these measures to test theory-driven associations, like looking at relationships between reward and executive systems, as I've done previously, but also looking at whether or not we can use these variables to predict relevant longitudinal outcomes. The second is this will be the largest brain imaging study to date of persons using methamphetamine. I'm pretty sure that this is by about 25% increase relative to what's out there. So it will be a very large sample. As I feel open science is incredibly important, we will provide the largest and only open access database of biopsychosocial measures on persons using methamphetamine. And the purpose of this is to support the broader scientific community for making advances in methamphetamine resource by capitalizing on this really unique resource that we've collected. And so in terms of potential clinical impacts, I like to think about this in terms of early intervention and treatment planning for persons using methamphetamine. So as with a lot of psychopathologies and behavioral disorders, so identifying a person using methamphetamine who might be in the greatest need of intervention, it often occurs after some catastrophic event has occurred, something like an overdose or institutionalization or job loss. So my approach to this and to my other research is really early intervention. So the approach is to try to develop the objective means for identifying individuals or persons using methamphetamine at the highest risk for these devastating consequences before they can occur. And the thought is this will allow us to identify these individuals and direct treatment resources and treatment planning in the most appropriate manner possible. So that was all I had. I just put up some references and resources here. If you guys want access to any of the anxiety and depression data I mentioned, please feel free to grab it. It should all be up online. So thank you so much, and please feel free to let me know if you have questions.
Let me introduce our own Roberto. He's an research assistant professor in UNL's Department of Sociology. He's a pilot project investigator as part of our center. And the project title is an ethnographic exploration of opioid agonist treatment barriers and facilitators among opioid users in rural Nebraska. So thank you, Roberto.
Oh, thanks everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about my pilot project. Some of you know already that I'll be moving in the fall to the anthropology department. Very excited about that. Different department, same home. Just for this, I've been very obedient. I selected an article to discuss that is not my own, and then I have a 10-minute presentation. Kali, next slide. Next. Yeah. You can see at the bottom, that's the title of my article about buprenorphine diversion in Pennsylvania. It's an article by Catherine McLean, one of my co-authors and collaborators. We actually sent a paper a few weeks ago about barriers to treatment, methadone and Suboxone treatment in rural Puerto Rico. So, and I think you'll see it's a very good connection to my own pilot project. The background is very simple. Buprenorphine maintenance therapy reduces mortality. It has been proven to reduce HIV transmission, Hep C, overdose risk. and general other drug-related harms, yet only 3% of people who use opioids were enrolled in the US in 2016. There are significant geographic and racial disparities. Some places, particularly East Coast or West Coast, are well served, while others, particularly in the Midwest and particularly in rural areas, are underserved. And the racial disparities mean that white folks get access disproportionately, while minorities have really hard access to buprenorphine. They usually go to methadone treatment, which is much more taxing. And of course, part of the background is that the buprenorphine diversion, which is the buprenorphine that you get on the street, non-prescribed, has not been sufficiently studied. This is an amazing question, is what motivates people who use drugs to rely on diverted buprenorphine instead of attending a program? And one of the things that the authors noticed that, particularly in Pennsylvania, there's a really heavy effort by the state to make buprenorphine available. Doctors can prescribe it with less restrictions, and also nurses in some cases can also prescribe. So the state make a big effort to expand access, but they still see that most people that use it diverted on the streets. So that's the question, why do they do that instead of going to a program? And the method is that they interviewed 20 people who acquired or received, either bought or got buprenorphine outside the clinic in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Next. The findings, the motivations, they do it for two reasons. Basically, to manage opioid withdrawal. That is, they're using opioids, they're using heroin, they don't get their dose that day, they're having trouble getting their fix, they're gonna start feeling really bad, feeling the very severe effects of opioid withdrawal. And to avoid that, they buy a tablet or a pill on the street, and they cope for that day or for that moment. And once they recover, they get the dose they need, they get the heroin they need, they keep doing heroin. And the other motivation is for detoxification. Maybe they don't trust the program, maybe they don't want to go to a clinic, but they want to progressively start cutting their own use. So they start using, instead of heroin, they start using buprenorphine bought on the street, and they start cutting their dose until they hopefully manage to be out of heroin and also out of buprenorphine. The other reasons: lack of availability, problems with access, transportation, different hours, and also acceptability. Bureaucratic requirements, they test you to make sure you are not using other drugs, and that's uncomfortable and dehumanizing, and they don't like that. And some don't like also the combination buprenorphine with naloxone. So they don't like that combination because they cannot use it recreationally, or they cannot use it as they would otherwise. So that's a main barrier as well. And the important finding also is that there's no recreational use of diverted buprenorphine. They don't use it to get high. They use it for the reasons the authors just mentioned in their findings. And finally, the recommendations: increase the geographical distribution, and consider using buprenorphine only without the naloxone, because if people they don't like it, what's the point? And also consider being more flexible as you deliver prescription buprenorphine, considering short term. So that really goes well with the idea that it wouldn't be a chronic treatment that you have to follow over many, many years. Next. And that really ties well, because it tells you, with my own pilot project, because it tells you what happens with people do not access treatments, and some of the motivations and some of the barriers that people have to actually not access treatment for opioid agonist treatments. So methadone and Suboxone have been shown to have positive effects, as I just showed. The previous paper was referring to positive effects to Suboxone, but they are not different from methadone. The main difference between Suboxone and methadone is that Suboxone is a film very thin, or a tablet and methadone is a liquid. And that, I should have said that before, for those of you that are not familiar with this, explains how you can divert Suboxone, because it's a pill. You can take it home and not take it. You can take half and sell the other half. With methadone, it's a liquid, and they make sure you drink it on the spot. So it's very hard. People do it, but it's very hard to divert methadone. But the positive effects are the same, and I just mentioned them, so I won't bother you repeating them again. The barriers to access in rural US are particularly the paucity of places where you can get either Suboxone and methadone, and that's really tragic because it coincides with an epidemic of overdose produced by fentanyl. So really bad to have people dying from overdose when they could really reduce that risk by going to treatment. But you know, the paucity of treatment makes that really hard. And finally, one of the important problems that we need to understand is that what barriers to methadone and Suboxone have been studied in urban settings, there's not a lot of studies in rural areas. And I think that's a contribution of my work. Some of the barriers that have been mentioned or documented are poverty, homelessness, lack of documentation, and as the previous paper show, also bureaucratic barriers, the testing, the dehumanization that is behind some of these treatments, a lack of respect, the limits, and some others as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about my aims in the next slide. My first aim is to use participant observation and treatment narratives to document their own experiences of accessing or not being able to access treatments in rural areas. And also not just the barriers, but the resources that participants can draw in order to enter treatment and remain there. The second aim, I think, is very self-explanatory, is just work with the community advisory board to contribute to make evidence-based recommendations to increase access and retention. So I'll say a little bit about the aim one. I want to be below 10 minutes so we can have a chance to have a conversation. But basically, participant observation, I plan to recruit 40 people, 20 currently enrolled and 40 not, that are opioid users, not necessarily injectors. I have a lax requirement only once in the past 30 days. And ask them about their treatment trajectories, or their treatment narratives. You know, it's a very interesting, the history of, you know, if they were in treatment ever, you know, what happened to them, why they decided to go to treatment, if they are stayed there, you know, what keeps them there, what are the barriers they have to keep in the program, and if they drop out or never enroll, why was that the case? And the second part, the participant observation, I wanted, because this won't be possible now after COVID, was to follow a subsample of 20 people who are actually enrolled in methadone or Suboxone, most likely methadone, and follow them to their appointments, trying to understand, you know, the barriers they might face and the experience of being a patient in these clinics, and see, you know, how they manage to navigate these, and also, as I mentioned, which kind of resources can they draw to keep going, to keep being enrolled. As you know, COVID changed many things for data collection. I don't think I'll be able to do the participant observation because we have social distancing requirements, but and I have to think still about a way of doing the interviews, the treatment narrative interviews with the participants. So a lot of challenges, a lot of things that are unexpected. But I wanted to give you just a quick idea of my pilot and where it comes from and where it might be going. Thank you for your attention, and hopefully you have some questions.
This is Nicole Weiss, assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island and the Department of Psychology. She's a pilot project leader for the Cobra on opioids and overdose. And her project title is Co-occurrence of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder and Opioid Use Outcomes Among Community Individuals. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody see my slides, or can anybody see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to do a little bit of integration of going more towards a rationale for my project, to then talking a little bit about this article that's going to be focused on speech markers, to then going back to my project. I promise there's a rationale for that. As many of us here probably know, there's pretty high co-occurrence between post-traumatic stress disorder and opioid use disorder. Evidence suggests that somewhere between 40 and 60% of people with an opioid use disorder report a lifetime history of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that individuals with both of those disorders have worse outcomes, both for PTSD and opioid use. So they tend to have earlier initiation of problematic use, more severe patterns, greater impairment in functioning and disability, and then greater comorbid mental, physical, and behavioral health outcomes. So much of the literature has used the self-medication model to help explain the relationship between PTSD and opioid use disorder. Essentially, what that model suggests is that people use opioids and essentially get into problematic patterns of use because in some way they're trying to mitigate some emotional pain that stems from their post-traumatic stress disorder. In one particular study, we found that about 95% of individuals who reported opioid use said that the motivation for that was to alleviate negative affect state. And we can also see in daily studies that earlier negative affect is predicting greater likelihood of later opioid use. There's some evidence to suggest that this opioid self-medication may actually be more prevalent amongst individuals with or without PTSD. And essentially what that data suggests is that individuals with PTSD might be more likely to use opioids in contexts that signal negative reinforcement. So in other words, use it as a means of reducing their distress. But there are some limitations with those studies, the most important being that they've really relied on subjective report. And so it's really important for us moving forward to find other ways in which to measure affective changes without relying on that subjective report. That will help us with the detection of opioid risk. So why do we want to identify objective measures? One is that people may not actually know how to, might not know what their current affective state is. So we have a good deal of literature, particularly in PTSD and OUD populations, that suggests some deficits in the ability to differentiate and identify emotions. We also know that people might be able to identify affective state, but they might not know until it's too late. So essentially what happens is that they don't realize that they're having an emotional response until it's a really intense or extreme emotional response. And at that point, it might be really difficult for them to intervene. And then the last thing is people may not actually want us to know about their emotional states. And so we can think here about maybe stigma or norms regarding the sharing of emotional information. And there might be really great examples of this, for instance, when we think of men versus women and their willingness to share emotions. So one way that I have thought about addressing this concern is to consider using speech data to help us to detect risk for opioid use. And so we know that speech can actually be used as a means of telling us a bit about people's affective states. So the different aspects of speech, respiration, articulation, those relate in some way to affective processes. And we see that these processes have been linked to both PTSD and opioid use disorder. So some of this research, for instance, suggests that we can use speech to predict whether somebody has PTSD or opioid use disorder, or whether one is currently using substances, as some example. But almost all of that research has been limited because it's collected that speech data using some kind of structured laboratory-based paradigm, and generally at one time point. And so there's limited understanding of how well that will actually generalize to real life behavior. So there's this recent paper that talks about how we might be able to gather speech data in people's day-to-day lives and then use that to predict behavioral outcomes. And so the paper that I chose here actually focuses on suicide as an outcome, but I'm proposing in my research that we could perhaps use the speech data to predict opioid outcomes. So this particular study, essentially the goal of it was to use machine learning to train and test models, which would use speech to accurately predict emotion, and then to show how that emotion from speech could help to distinguish between healthy controls and those with suicidal ideation. So regarding the speech data collection, Priority app, it's on individual's phone, and that's something that can be used to collect unstructured day-to-day phone call speech data. Essentially what happens there is that when the phone rings or when the participant makes a phone call, the app automatically turns on and it gathers data from the participant. Now, the really cool thing about this app is that it only collects speech data from the participant. It doesn't collect any data from the person that they're talking to or perhaps from background noise. And it does that through programming where you train it to collect data from a particular person through voice training data. That data was then paired with self-report data from Ecological Momentary Assessment, and that was utilized then to help train this data set. So what happened for this particular study is that they looked at a wide range of different emotion states and then looked at the pairing data with speech. It is actually much more complex than this figure suggests. There were a ton of different indices of speech data that were utilized here in the machine learning. But they did find that they were able to recognize 8 of 11 emotion states at an adequate level. And then what they did is they looked at those speech data and tried to differentiate between, again, healthy controls and those with a history of suicidal ideation. And they found indeed that they were able to differentiate between them. What you see on the screen, the starred areas, were the ways in which they were able to differentiate. So guilty, hopeless, anger, irritability, those are areas that seem to be important to differentiation. And so I thought this was a really cool study to share with the group because it suggests that perhaps within the opioid field that we can be using some speech data to help us to detect onset of opioid outcomes, things such as relapse, overdose, or even just use or craving events. And this might one day make it possible for us to intervene very early. For instance, individuals might call into a service provider and we might be able to record voice and then have some indication of risk of outcome. Alternatively, people could use this knowledge themselves, so they could have this program on their phone and it could provide them with some information about their own likelihood of relapse risk, overdose, etc. So as far as my pilot project goes, I would love to say that I use the Priority app for this, but unfortunately it's quite an expensive endeavor. So that is actually something that I'm proposing in an R01 application, but I wanted to collect some pilot data that would demonstrate feasibility of collection of data in the population of preference, and also ask questions about people's willingness to allow for the collection of speech data, anticipating that that might be a question that the reviewers would have. So essentially my broad overarching goals here were, one was really to expand my expertise. So I describe myself as a person with expertise in PTSD and substance use disorder. So I wanted to extend that to cover opioids, to develop this competitive R01 application, and then to gather some data that would help us to respond to the opioid epidemic. The specific aims, like I said, they were really centered on collecting some data for this R01 application. So we wanted to assess feasibility of recruitment and retention strategies. We're using a community-based sample. We're applying ecological momentary assessment in that sample. And much of the research with ecological momentary assessment has used clinical samples that are currently abstaining from opioids or in structured environments where perhaps it would be a bit easier to complete and be compliant with surveys. We also wanted to look at prevalence of PTSD in a community sample versus clinical sample, acceptability of using ecological momentary assessment and speech recording, and then the necessary time to capture some of the opioid outcomes of interest, so things like overdose, as well as other EMA relevant factors, like how compliant folks would be and at what point they would become fatigued with the process. So the goal here was for us to collect data from 100 trauma-exposed community individuals who all have past month opioid misuse. They'd come in with us for an initial session. We do some diagnoses around PTSD and opioid use disorder, assess willingness to allow for collection of speech data. Following this, they'd participate in ecological momentary assessment. So every day, 5 times a day at random intervals, they'd provide information on things such as affect and opioid use, craving, actual use, relapse, treatment-seeking behavior, etc. Those individuals would be randomized to do that for either 30 or 90 days. And the 90-day was a small subsample. Again, that was really just to better assess the time period necessary to capture some of the outcomes of interest. And then after that, they're going to come back into the lab for a follow-up session. And here we just assess acceptability of ecological momentary assessment, as well as get some information about why there was missing data when that was present. So for instance, if they were in some kind of structured environment, like incarcerated. So that is a brief overview of my summary. I'm just going to acknowledge the pilot project funding as well as my current K. And I'm happy to take any questions from folks.